Part 1. You will hear an interview about a transportation survey. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 5. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 5.
Good morning. We're conducting a local transport survey. Would you be willing to answer a few questions about your travel routine today? It shouldn't take long, maybe around 5 minutes.
Sure, that's all right. I have a bit of time before my next appointment.
Thank you. First, could I take your full name, please?
It's Lucy Rivers. I don't usually share my details, but if it helps improve transport, I'm happy to.
I understand, and I really appreciate that. Next, can I ask for your year of birth?
Yes, I was born in the 1980s.
That's great. And what's the postcode where you live, please?
It's FD48HD.
Oh, sorry. Did you say 8HD?
No, let me repeat. It's FD48, then H for Harry, and D for teacher.
That's interesting. I think that area is close to Greenwood, isn't it?
Actually, it's just outside Greenwood in Helston, about 2 miles from the main shopping centre.
I know Housestone. I used to bike through there on weekends. Lovely place. Now, about your journey today. Did you come here by car, bus, or another method of public transport?
I came by train this morning. My car's in for repair anyway. But even if it wasn't, I'd still prefer the train because it's generally more reliable.
That was today's the 16th of June, right?
Yes, the 16th. Time really flies. I can't believe we're already halfway through June.
Probably not. True. And I can see you've got a few shopping bags. Was that the main reason for coming into the city?
Actually, I have a job interview later. Afterwards, I plan to do some shopping and maybe meet a friend for lunch. But the primary purpose of my trip is definitely the interview.
Excellent. So, any reason you decided not to drive here?
Well, typically I avoid driving in the city centre because the cost of parking is really high. Even if you find a space, you end up paying a small fortune.
I see. So, which station did you depart from this morning?
I boarded at Winshaw Station. It's quite near my home, only about a 10-minute walk.
I see. How do you spell Renshaw, please?
It's Renshaw.
Oh, thanks for that.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to read questions 6 to 10. Now listen carefully and answer questions 6 to 10.
Now, moving on, can I ask you, how did you find today's train service?
Usually it's quite punctual. However, it was running late and behind schedule by about 15 minutes today, which was quite stressful.
That's unfortunate. Anything else about the service?
The train frequency in the evening isn't great. If I stay in town after dinner, I can be stuck waiting nearly an hour for the next train.
Right. Now, do you use a car at all?
Not often. My sister is the main driver. She frequently takes the car on weekends for her shopping needs, whereas I stick to public transport.
And what about bikes?
Actually, I own a bicycle, but I hate cycling downtown because of the pollution and constant traffic jams. It doesn't feel safe or pleasant.
That is understandable. Do you have a place to store it securely?
Not really. My building has no dedicated bike storage, so I'm forced to keep it in the shed hallway, and sometimes the neighbours complain.
Right, that must be inconvenient. Thank you very much for your time.
You are welcome.
That is the end of part 1. You now have some time to check your answers. Now turn to part 2. Part 2. You will hear a woman giving an orientation speech for a volunteering organisation called Hope in Action. First, you have some time to read questions 11 to 15. Now listen carefully and answer questions 11 to 15.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the orientation session for Hope in Action. I truly appreciate all of you taking time out of your busy schedules to consider volunteering with us. Our organization connects committed individuals with local families and community services in need of assistance. We're always searching for enthusiastic people who can spare a few hours a week. Now, before I begin the main part of the presentation, I'd like to mention the seating situation. We expected around 20 attendees, but more than 30 of you arrived. Fantastic news, but it means some chairs have been placed rather close together. I hope you'll bear with us for this short half-hour talk session. We frequently receive questions about who can volunteer, especially regarding age requirements. In reality, we welcome people as young as 16, and we also have vibrant volunteers in the 60s and 70s. We find that age, by itself, doesn't determine whether you'll show up and work diligently. Reliability is far more crucial. Another inquiry concerns training. Many ask if they'll be left on their own. Far from it. We have comprehensive face-to-face training sessions before you start and continuing workshop throughout your placement. Although we do have full-time managers, they often deal with, administrative tasks, so the more hands-on guidance typically comes from our experienced volunteers. Before signing up, consider a couple of important points. We're not here to judge your motives. Whether you're seeking work experience or fulfilling a personal passion, it's all valid. However, time management is key. If your calendar is already full, volunteering might become too stressful. Also, think about your finances. We don't pay volunteers, so it's entirely your decision whether you can handle unpaid work. The most essential factor is your dedication and your willingness to see tasks through.
Before you hear the rest of this speech, you have some time to look at questions 16 to 20. Now listen carefully and answer questions 16 to 20.
Let's look at some areas where we currently need volunteers, along with the skills or traits that can make you particularly helpful. Now, let's start with fundraising. We often encourage volunteers to think of original, eye-catching ways to raise money, as collecting coins in the box on the high street can feel monotonous. If you have a creative flair or enjoy organizing exciting events, we'd love to hear your ideas. For park cleanups, we have groups who go out to collect litter and maintain local green spaces. This can be quite physical, involving bending, squatting, or even walking uphill carrying rubbish bags, so a moderate level of fitness will serve you well. Now, moving on to play helpers. If children's health and well-being interest you, we run after-school sessions called Healthy Living Club. You don't have to be a parent, but it helps if you understand basic nutrition and can simplify health concepts for younger audiences. A reading or drama club, this is specifically for children with physical disabilities. We do at least 3 small theatre performances each year inspired by the books they've been reading. If you've dabbled in acting, or even if you just love theatre, your experience would be greatly appreciated. For first aid training, I would say, this team travels to different community centres to teach essential first aid. Before you can train others, though, you will have to absorb a great deal of information yourself. Remembering the correct procedures and medical steps is paramount. Because, you see, medical treatment is the best way to serve your community after all. All right, does anyone have questions at this stage?
That is the end of part 2. You now have some time to check your answers. Now turn to part 3.
Part 3. You will hear 2 students called Jean and Thomas discussing their sports science course. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 24. Now listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 24.
Hi, Thomas. How are you enjoying the course so far?
Yeah, I think it's good.
Remind me, why did you decide to study sports science? Didn't you want to be a professional athlete when you were at school?
Yeah, that was my goal, and all my classmates assumed I would achieve it. They thought I was brilliant.
That must have been a nice feeling.
I thought I could win anything. There was no one who could run faster than me.
Exactly. So what happened? Did your mum and dad want you to be more academic?
Not at all. Perhaps they should have pushed me harder, though.
What do you mean?
I think I should have practiced more.
What makes you say that?
Well, I went out to Kenya for a couple of weeks to train.
Really? Oh, I didn't know that.
I was chosen to go there out of loads of kids and run with some of the top teenage athletes in the world. And I was so calm about it. I just kept thinking how fortunate I was, what a great chance this was. Everyone back home was so proud of me. But once we started competing, I very quickly realised I wasn't good enough.
That must have been a huge shock.
I thought, this can't be happening. I was used to winning.
I'm sorry to hear that.
It's okay. I'm over it now, and I think it's much better to do a university course. And this one has such a variety of sports-related areas. It's going to be good.
Oh, I agree. I chose it because of that.
Before you hear the rest of the discussion, You have some time to look at questions 25 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 25 to 30.
So, Jian, have you thought of any ideas for the discussion session next week on technology and sport?
We have to cover more than one sport, don't we?
Yeah.
You know, we always think technology is about the future, but we could gather some ideas about past developments in sport.
Look at early types of equipment, perhaps. I remember reading something about table tennis bats once, how they ended up being covered with pimpled rubber.
'Cause they were just wooden at first, I'd imagine.
Yeah. In about the 1920s, a factory was making rolls of the rubber in bulk for something like horse harnesses.
Really?
Yeah, and someone realised that it would make a perfect covering for the wooden bats.
So, what about cricket? That's had a few innovative changes. Maybe the pads they wear on their legs?
I don't think they've changed much, but I'm just looking on the internet. And it says that when the first cricket helmet came in 1978, the Australian batsman who first wore it was booed and jeered by people watching because it was so ugly.
Wow! Players have to protect themselves from getting hurt. I mean, everyone wears one now.
Unlike the cycle helmet.
Well, unless you're a professional. But you're right, many ordinary bikers don't wear a helmet.
Hey, look at these pictures of original helmet designs. This one looks like an upside-down bowl.
Yet the woman's laughing. She's so proud to be wearing it.
It says serious cyclists ended up with wet hair from all the hard exercise.
I guess that's why they have large air vents in them now, so that the skin can breathe more easily.
OK, so we've done helmets. What about golf balls? Or better still, golf clubs. They've changed a lot.
Yeah. I remember my great-grandfather telling me that because a club was made entirely of wood, it would easily break and players had to get another.
There's no wood at all in them now, is there?
No, they're much more powerful.
The same must be true of hockey sticks.
I don't think so, because players still use wooden sticks today. What it does say here, though, is that when the game started, you had to produce a stick yourself.
I guess they just weren't being manufactured. So, one more perhaps? What about football?
Well, I know the first balls were made of animal skin.
Yeah, they covered them with pieces of leather that were stitched together. But the balls let in water when it rained.
Oh, that would have made them much heavier.
That's right. You can imagine the damage to players' necks when the ball was headed.
Oh, how painful that must have been.
Yeah. Well, I think we can put together some useful ideas and...
That is the end of part 3. You now have half a minute to check your answers to part 3.
Now turn to part 4.
Part 4. You will hear a zoology student giving a presentation on bird migration. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
Scientists believe that a majority of the Earth's bird population migrate in some fashion or other. Some travel seasonally for relatively short distances, such as birds that move from their winter habitats in lowlands to mountaintops for the summers. Others, like the Arctic tern, travel more than 25,000 miles seasonally between the northern and southern poles. Bird migration has been studied over many centuries through a variety of observations. But until relatively recently, where birds went to in the winter was considered something of a mystery. The lack of modern science and technology led to many theories that we now recognise as error-filled and even somewhat amusing. Take hibernation theory, for example. 2,000 years ago, it was commonly believed that when birds left an area, they went underwater to hibernate in the seas and oceans. Another theory for the regular appearance and disappearance of birds was that they spent winter hidden in mud till the weather changed and food became abundant again. The theory that some birds hibernate persisted until experiments were done on caged birds in the 1940s, which demonstrated that birds have no hibernation instinct. One of the earliest naturalists and philosophers from ancient Greece was Aristotle, who was the first writer to discuss the disappearance and reappearance of some bird species at certain times of year. He developed the theory of transmutation, the seasonal change of one species into another by observing redstarts and robins. He observed that in the autumn, small birds called redstarts began to lose their feathers, which convinced Aristotle that they changed into robins for the winter and back into redstarts in the summer. These assumptions are understandable, given that this pair of species are similar in shape, but are a classic example of an incorrect interpretation based on correct observations. The most bizarre theory was put forward by an English amateur scientist, Charles Morton, in the 17th century. He wrote a surprisingly well-regarded paper, claiming that birds migrate to the moon and back every year. He came to this conclusion as the only logical explanation for the total disappearance of some species. One of the key moments in the development of migration theory came in 1822, when a white stork was shot in Germany. This particular stork made history because of the long spear in its neck, which incredibly had not killed it. Everyone immediately realised this spear was definitely not European. It turned out to be a spear from a tribe in Central Africa. This was a truly defining moment in the history of ornithology, because it was the first evidence that storks spend their winters in sub-Saharan Africa. You can still see the arrow stork in the zoological collection of the University of Rostock in Germany. People gradually became aware that European birds moved south in autumn and north in summer, but didn't know much about it until the practice of catching birds and putting rings on their legs became established. Before this, very little information was available about the actual destinations of particular species and how they travelled there. People speculated that larger birds provided a kind of taxi service for smaller birds by carrying them on their backs. This idea came about because it seemed impossible that small birds, weighing only a few grams, could fly over vast oceans. This idea was supported by observations of bird behaviour, such as the harassment of larger birds by smaller birds. The development of bird ringing by a Danish schoolteacher, Hans Christian Cornelius Mortensen, made many discoveries possible. This is still common practice today and relies upon what is known as recovery. This is when ringed birds are found dead in the place they have migrated to and identified. Huge amounts of data were gathered in the early part of the 20th century, and for the first time in history, people understood where birds actually went to in winter. In 1931, an atlas was published showing where the most common species of European birds migrated to. More recent theories about bird migration vary widely.
That is the end of part 4.